Hello, everyone. My name is Seth Robbins. I'm the director of our Freshman Success Center at BYU, Idaho. I teach ESL courses as well as our first year freshman experience course. I'm excited to be able to join you, at least remotely, during these interesting times. My presentation is entitled Gritty ELLs, the correlation between grit, academic achievement, and retention in an online academic context. Angela Duckworth defines grit as passion and perseverance for long-term goals. And I was interested in pursuing this because our university offers, in conjunction with Brigham Young University Pathway, we offer online ESL courses to help students to be able to gain the academic vocabulary and language that they need to be able to effectively matriculate into BYU Idaho online, and we offer these courses to international students all over the world. And so for my dissertation, I wanted to be able to study grit and see if it was a determinant of academic success and retention among Spanish speakers and Brazilian Portuguese speakers. In the literature, grit, the factors of perseverance and interest are highly correlated first-order factors that load upon the higher-order factor of grit. So just as she defined, there's perseverance and also passion. And these two factors load onto this higher concept known as grit. And also in the literature, grit is correlated with academic achievement in higher education settings, as well as retention in various higher education settings among a variety of demographics and contexts. So here are the research questions that I ask. What is the factor structure of the grit construct in a second language? What is the correlation between grit and variables of academic success, such as GPA and retention, among online ELLs? And what is the association between grit and variables of academic success when considering age, gender, parental education level, and first language among Spanish and Portuguese speakers who are online ELLs? And here are the findings. I found that the two-factor model is the best fit for the data. In a lot of the research, people would conflate interest and perseverance as a one-factor model. But in doing confirmatory factor analysis, I found that, in fact, these two are highly related factors, as you can see with the 0.67 coefficient, but not so related that they're construed as the same factor by those who took the survey. And as you can see, each question has sufficient factor loadings upon the respective factors, with the lowest being question 3, which had a factor loading of 0.38, which is somewhat low. What was interesting is this corroborated Duckworth's finding, where she found that question 4, which talks about changing interests from year to year, and question 3, which talks about changing interests from month to month, she found that those were likewise had lower factor loading coefficients. What was also interesting is that those who were surveyed seemed to construe these as very similar questions, as you can imagine, because their correlation coefficient was 0.28, which was kind of interesting. I found that the survey was highly reliable with a Cronbach's alpha coefficient of 0.85, and it was highly stable across time. I administered a pretest and a post-test with a correlation of 0.77. What I found was that the whole grit score, meaning conflating the two factors together, was correlated with GPA, but it was not correlated with retention. It only accounted for about 2.5% of variance in GPA. When I looked at the factors individually, which is important because it is the best fit was a two-factor model, I found that perseverance modestly predicts both GPA and retention. However, interest only modestly predicts GPA, but not retention. What was really interesting is that I found GPA was the highest predictor of retention, and by itself it accounted for 21% of the variance. When in the presence of whole grit score, meaning the single grit score where perseverance and passion scores are conflated together. In the presence of whole grit score, parental education total, and age, females were grittier than males. And when holding whole grit score and parental education total constant, it was Spanish speakers who were grittier than Portuguese speakers. But the most interesting thing was that GPA, in the presence of both gender and first language, meaning that when gender and first language are held constant, GPA was the largest predictor of retention, accounting for 37% of the variance. So here are some key takeaways. Number one, the grit scale is not the panacea to solving all issues involving GPA and retention among at-risk international students. Many of these students come from lower socioeconomic strata. And so grit was not the only factor at play. And there's one model proposed by Rovai back in 2003 that might account for some of the reasons why grit isn't the solely responsible for GPA. Although by the graphic here, it's definitely a piece of the pie, but not the whole pie. Some other pieces of this pie might be student characteristics such as age or ethnicity or intellectual development, student skills, computer literacy, time management, reading and writing, some internal factors such as their own study habits, their commitments to their goals, self-esteem, accessibility to support services. External factors, what their financial situation looks like, how many hours per week they're working. If they're working a full-time job, but also moonlighting at one or two other jobs, which is common among these particular students, it can be a challenge. And also life crises. I had a couple of outliers who gave themselves very high grit scores, but nonetheless had 0 GPA and only lasted one semester. And a couple of them emailed me and indicated that they were facing such things as one subject personally had cancer. Another subject was taking care of his mother who had cancer. Another subject dropped out of the program to pursue law school at a university in the United States, which seemed like maybe a good reason to drop out of this online program. So external factors can be outside of the student can play large roles in whether or not someone is able to persist, regardless of the internal factor of how gritty they might be towards this particular goal, learning English, matriculating to an American university online. And then there's some sociolinguistic factors that Rovai actually doesn't take into account very robustly in his model. And these include proficiency, particularly CALP, cognitive academic language proficiency, cultural nuances between their education in their home country versus an American education online, as well as maybe culture shock. The second takeaway is that perseverance actually might be more of a universal trait, irrespective of culture, because it predicted both GPA and retention. But the interest factor or the passion factor may be more culturally nuanced. Another key takeaway is that competing superordinate goals, for instance, education, job, family, recreation, are likely culturally situated. So pursuing an education might be one of the top priorities in that particular culture, but in other cultures, family might be the uppermost superordinate goal that someone might have. And so if it comes between choosing family things versus choosing educational things, those might be culturally nuanced goals. And then the two-factor analyses, these are best suited for ascertaining predictive properties of grade. By conflating the factors together, it might actually skew the data. As we've seen here, that interest doesn't load as highly as perseverance, and interest is not a very strong predictor of retention, although it was a modest predictor of GPA. The third takeaway is general grittiness may not be as predictive of grittiness within a specific domain, as evidenced by Duckworth's work in 2016, as well as Plonsky, who did a study among Iranian students and change the wording of the grit scale to fit within the specific context of learning English. So a person might be generally gritty in their life, but not gritty in a specific domain, such as learning English. They might be grittier at learning an instrument, perhaps. And then the predictive nature of grit is contingent in part upon the audience-specific language. In this case, I translated the scale into both Spanish and Portuguese, and then it had it back translated back into English to compare between the original English and the translated English. And this was important in order to ensure a higher validity of the scale itself. I didn't want the learners to be confused by perhaps some of the language in a second language, in this case, English. And then takeaway number 4, it's important to look at, in terms of triage for at-risk online ESL students, and I would even venture on-campus matriculated ELLs, it's important to look at early GPA trends and to try to provide triage as soon as possible, because it might not be a diligence factor on the part of the students. It could be external factors that may be inhibiting their ability to do as well as they would like to. Furthermore, it kind of takes a village, to teach and to help nurture a student. And so both online and on-campus student services, online and on-campus instructors, and then local administrators with support auxiliaries could prove effective in early interventions if we're seeing students that are struggling. I'm finding this to be true anecdotally, although I'm gathering evidence for this on my campus for both international first-year freshman students as well as domestic freshman students, that early intervention is helping students to get more of the services that they need. And I'm hoping that over time it might prove efficacious in their ability to succeed academically. So in conclusion, the 2-factor model of grit is most predictive of variables of academic success, GPA and retention, among online ESL learners. What's important is if the scale is used in the future, it's important to keep in mind the audience you have and to tailor the language of the scale to that audience. GPA, more so than grit, GPA was the most predictive of retention, and by itself accounted for 21% of the variance in retention. However, more research is needed to be focused on, really ascertaining further the predictive variables of GPA. And as I mentioned, revised model might be interesting to look at in future experiments, as well as maybe looking at the correlation of growth mindset and looking at the combined correlation of growth mindset and grit as it relates to things like GPA and retention among ELLs through regressional analyses. Finally, the generalizability of grit is still in question. This is a big question in the field. Is grit really a thing? How big of a thing is it in terms of variance, what it accounts for? And 2, can it be taught? So those are still some of the questions that are still being asked by my study, as well as being asked by the field at large. So that concludes my presentation. If you've sat through this and were hard up enough for entertainment to watch this online, I appreciate your time, and please email me if you have any questions. I would be more than happy to try to answer those. Thank you so much.